Welcome and thanks for joining me on Talk the Walk. I'm Sarah Wong. In much of the world, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to rage unchecked almost 1 year after the coronavirus was first reported in the Chinese city of Wuhan. Europe is bracing for a dark winter with record daily uptakes across the continent. Across the Atlantic, the United States leads the world in both infections and deaths, while President Donald Trump's handling of the pandemic could thwart his re-election bid. Amid the gloom and doom stands socialist China, where normalcy has largely returned after unprecedented measures were taken to clamp down on the virus early on. One pandemic, different results. But why? Let's bring in Beijing bureau chief for The Economist, David Rennie. He's also the author of the Cha Guan column on China. Hi, Mr. Rennie. Good to have you with us. We appreciate your time.
Hello.
So, I have friends on the mainland who's living their lives almost like the pandemic's never happened. Restaurants are open, parties are held, and even in Wuhan, people stop wearing masks anymore. Can we declare now that China has outsmarted the West in combating the coronavirus pandemic?
So I think it's clear that most Chinese are not frightened of the virus in their day-to-day lives. You see this whether you're looking at airline travel or train travel, as you say. Still in Beijing, we do wear face masks because it's the most sensitive city, I guess. But there was this real sense of fear for a lot of the spring, a lot of the summer. That's now gone. We saw that with Golden Week, with the National Day holidays around October the 1st. For the first time, you saw large numbers of Chinese families out and about, kind of catching up on the sort of the leisure time that they had lost. And you see this in the economic statistics too. You're seeing economic demand coming back. It's still not normal. You can't go to a packed cinema, and there are still kind of COVID controls in some buildings. But the restaurants are busting again, as you say. And so the Chinese government is basically getting ready to take a victory lap and to say that, as you say, that China's socialist system has proved uniquely effective. Now, I think that's actually not completely true, and I think that may also prove very provocative in the outside world. But that's certainly the internal messaging here in China.
So we know that China has put the entire city of Wuhan, where the coronavirus first reported, into draconian lockdown in January. And, public transport was cut, restaurants are closed, people are not allowed to move freely on the streets. But we take a look at Europe, where countries like Italy and Spain, they also imposed early lockdown when the coronavirus first flared up in their countries. But it doesn't seem to be working right now because they're grappling with a full-blown second wave at the moment, with more cases every day recorded compared in the Europe's first wave. Why do you think that's the case?
So it's been very interesting. From early on, it became clear that what China was trying to do, along with a few other places, Australia, New Zealand and Taiwan, and note that those other places are islands, what China was trying to do was really very, very different from anything tried in Western Europe or in America. China's ambition from about March on was to not just control the virus, but to eliminate it within China's borders. And people paid a heavy price. I have been in China all year. I spent 6 weeks in all in quarantine, some of it basically unable to leave my apartment. And that's been true for hundreds of millions of mainland Chinese this year. They spent, 3-4 weeks in around March, basically unable to go outside. You had in some areas, a bunch of houses would be given a single paper ticket and told that one of the 5 or 6 households had the right to go to the market once a week to buy food for everyone else. And otherwise, everyone was locked indoors. Remember, a lot of Chinese migrant workers were stuck back in their home villages because this outbreak kicked off around Chinese New Year. So they would normally have gone back home for a week or 10 days. They found themselves stuck for nearly 2 months. And a lot of them were not being paid because they weren't at work. So they were dipping into savings. They lost a lot of income. So there was a tremendous amount of sacrifice by hundreds of millions of people. And the result is that China has eliminated the virus. The other very painful thing that China's had to do is essentially lock down international travel. It's a strange experience being a foreigner here in mainland China at the moment because there really are very few other foreigners. There's no tourists. very few students, and a lot of expats haven't come back.
You mentioned about the tremendous sacrifices that Chinese people have made during this pandemic to fulfill the government goals to eliminating the virus once and for all. And that brings us the question of public support and public compliance of government policies. And if we take a look at Europe now, like there's protests in Italy and Spain and France where people hit the streets to voice a position against the restrictions the government imposed in a bid to stem the spread of the virus. But in China, we observe this widespread public compliance with government orders. Why do you think that's the case? Is political system the only reason to ensure mandatory public compliance?
So I would say that the difference looks to be more social systems and culture, and also basic kind of fear of these viruses. Because let's not forget that although the Chinese Communist Party is absolutely adamant that its handling of COVID demonstrates the superiority of communist rule, it demonstrates that authoritarian systems are more effective, it demonstrates that the party is uniquely able to mobilize a disciplined, self-sacrificing Chinese public who are not tainted by the selfishness and the individualism of, say, Americans or Western Europeans. That is very clearly the Chinese government propaganda message to their people.
Agreed.
But the difference is, I think, you have to look at Taiwan, which is a democracy, which has a free press, which did not use the same authoritarian methods, relied much more on voluntary compliance by the Taiwanese people, and has had a fantastically successful COVID response. It helps that they're an island, but they have just gone 200 days without a new COVID infection. That was announced today, which is an incredible achievement. So I don't think that I'm ready to sign up to Communist Party kind of propaganda that this is proof that only communist governments can eliminate this virus. What I do think is that clearly Western individualism, which looks a lot like selfishness in some cases, is part of the explanation for those protests, people refusing to wear face masks because somehow that's kind of tyranny, which is clearly nonsense and selfish. But I do also think a big difference is that people in Asia, perhaps because you have had previous breaks of things like SARS, and you've had things like other outbreaks of avian influenza, H1N1, things like that. My experience living in China now in all for 6 years is that people in this region, including in Hong Kong where you are, they're just more scared of respiratory diseases, avian influenzas, SARS. And so when this broke out, people were much more willing to put on a face mask and take it really seriously. And I think part of that in China as well is that outside the biggest cities, the hospital system just is not very effective. So if you get really sick and you live in the countryside in this country, you are a long way from a decent hospital and a high-tech ambulance. And I think maybe that explains some of the complacency in places like the United States or in my country, Britain, because people are very used to the idea that if you get really sick, there is a safety net. There will always be a kind of world-class hospital around the corner. People don't think that here, and so they were more willing to comply. But I would push back at the idea that people, that this can only be done in communist systems.
Right. I want to get a quick response from you on, because you mentioned Taiwan, which has been accredited in his response in clamping down the virus without imposing draconian measures like lockdown and massive and intelligence surveillance. But if we take a look at South Korea, New Zealand, they're all democracies, and they considerably all reined in the outbreak quite well. That kind of negate the uniqueness of China's authoritarian one-party model in its effectiveness in clamping down the virus. But is it also because, do you think, that the population, the size of the population in those countries, South Korea, New Zealand, and Taiwan, which is a region, is not that massive compared with China?
I mean, South Korea is not a small country. It's got a pretty hefty population. I mean, even Taiwan is 23 million people. That's more or less the same size as the Australian population. These are not small places, and they have done a good job. They did use, high-tech surveillance and quarantine, but it was much more kind of voluntary compliance than the heavy-handed system. Some of the stories we saw early on here of people basically being locked in their own doors by the police. One thing I do think that having been here for the duration of this pandemic, not least because I can't leave, because if I did leave, I wouldn't get back in. We do give, I think we should give credit to the party does have an extraordinary ability to mobilize resources on a massive scale. So testing is a really interesting example that now that the virus is basically under control here, we see this time and again. We're seeing this recently with an outbreak in Kashgar. Before that, it was in Qingdao. Before that, we saw some outbreaks up near Russia in places like Harbin. As soon as there is even a tiny outbreak by Western standards, a dozen cases, 20 cases, 100 cases, you see literally millions of people being tested. I think Qingdao on the coast of China tested 9 million people in 5 days.
Yeah.
Now, I know from looking at news reports from my own country, Britain, that people who think they might have COVID, sometimes it takes 2 or 3 weeks to get a test result, which is basically nuts. And it was very impressive at a certain moment here over the summer to see basically Beijing systematically tested every single group. We saw you could go past sports stadiums and see hundreds, if not thousands, of people lined up. And one day it was the waitresses, all in their waitress uniforms. The next day it was hairdressers, all dressed in their kind of salon uniforms, teachers, real estate workers, sector by sector. People in contact with the public were systematically, massively tested. Testing is now very easy here. It's very cheap. It's very fast. And that's clearly played an enormous role. So there is a kind of mobilization to this. But we do have to remember that this began in part because the authoritarian system had incentives for local officials in Wuhan to cover this up. And I think there are the seeds of a really dangerous political perception gap between the Chinese public, who basically now feel that COVID is probably something on balance to feel proud about, and the rest of the world, particularly those countries you mentioned, which are going to go into a second wave this winter in Europe and in America, where the idea that China is celebrating this pandemic, which is still causing such human and economic damage in the West, I think that gap in perceptions is going to prove very provocative. And I think that the Chinese government maybe has not yet fully realized how provocative it is to be saying the world should congratulate and thank China for its handling of COVID.
Yeah, they surely get us all thinking here. Well, that seems like a good place to take a short break. We'll be right back. Stay tuned.